Welcome to the Fontaine Fifth Wheel training module on the No-Slack system.
We hope you find this information both informative and helpful.
We're going to address issues such as product identification, lubrication, adjustment, and some commonly asked questions when running our fifth wheel.
Greetings, Steve Wyatt here. I'm going to lead you through the next portion of our presentation, which is product identification. Fontaine offers different top plates, whether it's a 6000, 7000, Clean Connect, or even our H7. And of course, these top plates mount on different brackets. They can be either a stationary or an air slide, and air slides have different slide lengths, and everything has a different height. What is an easy way for you to identify which Fontaine model that you have? On the front band of each fifth wheel, you'll find a red tag. On that red tag lists the model number. For some reason, if the red tag is missing, we also have a 9-digit serial number etched into the rear toe section of the fifth wheel. You can get that serial number, call Fontaine, and they will tell you what the model number is. It's also a good idea to have both pieces of information, or at least the serial number, should you need assistance from Fontaine. Have that handy. It will really help the techs when you give them a call. Thank you. All right, now let's take a look at some of the internal parts of the locking system. Of course, this is your pull handle used to release from your trailer. This piece is a secondary lock. It's very important. It's a safety feature that we offer. Once the fifth wheel is closed, it will not reopen unless you pull it. You can get in here with a pry bar, do whatever you want. Try to reopen that fifth wheel, and it's not going to come open unless you pull the handle. This is the bumper. This is what the kingpin actually strikes to engage the lock. When the fifth wheel is in the open position, the bumper sets up on the latch base. The kingpin will enter the throat, knock the bumper off the latch base, which will activate the locking system. It's a two-piece locking system. You have a jaw that goes in around your kingpin, and then a wedge comes in behind it. And the wedge is tapered, so it will go in just as far as the leftover space will allow. This is the timer. This is what ensures that the jaw goes in first and the wedge comes in behind it. The long piece here is the operating handle. It keeps all the pieces connected together. So what that means is one piece can't move without all the pieces moving. When the wheel closes, the wheel snaps shut. You'll notice the handle goes all the way in. That lets you know that your jaw and wedge are secure behind the kingpin and that your secondary lock is engaged. Anytime you're within 1 inch of the outer band of the wheel, you're properly coupled.
Hello, I'm Bert Ellis, and I want to talk to you about proper lubrication of your Fontaine fifth wheel. Before you begin, make sure you have a clean surface to work with. Get a putty knife and drag out all of the dirty grease that may contain abrasives and things that can scratch the fifth wheel. Apply a light layer of fifth wheel grease, preferably a moly-based grease. Not too heavy, just a nice even coat. You're not trying to make a birthday cake here. More importantly, make sure you pay attention to this lock. Also clean it before you go in there. It's a time to inspect the lock while you're doing all of this. You can take the pressure off of the jaw of the wedge by pulling out on the pull handle about 1 inch, and this will take the spring pressure off between the jaw and the wedge. Very important to get grease down in there between the two of them. It's also a great time to inspect the jaw and the wedge and make sure you're still feeling serrations with the edge of your screwdriver. Now that we've inspected and lubricated the jaw and the wedge, let's move over to the saddle bearings. You may notice that there are grease zerk fittings on either side of the saddle bearing. There's no need to lubricate these, as there are lube-free bracket liners in all of our Fontaine fifth wheels now that require no lubrication. It will not hurt the fifth wheel if you do lubricate them, but just to keep in mind, it isn't necessary. Now let's take a look at the underside of the fifth wheel that needs attention. We prefer that you use a white lithium-based grease and an aerosol dispenser to hit the pivot points 1, 2, and 3, as well as the timer with a light coat. With all that done, you'll have proper operation of the underside.
Hey Steve, why don't you talk a little bit about that pull handle and let us know the importance of it.
All right, well, Mike, what we see from time to time is these pull handles will get bent. You can look at some competitive products out there. They got a big, thick, flat bar that really looks robust. Ours is a sacrificial piece. Because what happens when the fifth wheel is in the open position, the handle's out, driver misses with the kingpin, brings it up from the side, he hits a handle, it gives way, it bends very easily. The reason for that is if it absorbs that force, that's all going to be transferred somewhere down in the locking system, and you're going to end up with damage down here. So this piece is so easy and inexpensive to replace, we make it sacrificial. Now, let's say it gets bent. Everybody wants to try to straighten it out. You can do that short term. Get back to the shop and go ahead and get it replaced, because what happens, a new handle is this long. All of a sudden you've bent it a time or two and tried to straighten it out, and now it's a little wavy. So your length isn't this long, now it's only this long. So what'll happen, the handle will come in, bottom out against the side of the fifth wheel. Everything's properly engaged, but maybe you didn't allow that wedge to make its last step in there. So you're putting some premature wear, some slack down into the system. So when you get back to the shop, go ahead, 1/4 pin is all you have to take out, pop it out, pull your handle out, put a new one in before you hit the road.
Basically, with the secondary lock, the pull handle, it's out. To engage the secondary lock, my handle has to be an inch or less from the throat of the wheel. And basically, if it's an inch or more out, my secondary lock's not engaged. Let me show you how the secondary lock works. Basically, if it's an inch or more out, the wheel sits up like this. This is your rotating cam right here. Get it switched over there. And this cam basically just floats up here. An inch or less from the skirt of the wheel, secondary lock. If the wheel ever tries to open back up, it basically engages. What's nice about our secondary lock, it's the only one in the industry that basically runs itself. You don't have to do anything to it. No maintenance, no nothing.
And what I noticed with that, you have a nice straight pull. You don't have to pull the handle out and manipulate it in any way to get it to stay open. It's straight out.
Exactly.
Wheels open.
Exactly. So when you do your tug test, if the secondary lock's not fully engaged, you could get the jaws to squirt. But just keep in mind, always check your pull handle. Make sure it's at inch or less, and it can be all the way up against the skirt. I'm more worried about an inch or more out that the secondary lock doesn't get engaged. Hey Steve.
Yes, sir.
Now that we've talked about the pull handle and its importance in the way that the secondary lock's automatic, what's some other key points that we want to inspect during this process?
It's very important that you get in here and look at your hardware. Make sure your springs are in place. You've got your secondary lock spring, you have a bumper spring, and you have a timer spring. If any of these are off or missing or weak, it will affect the overall function of the locking system. Also, make sure your mounting hardware is in place. These are lock nuts on here. They shouldn't go anywhere, but it's a good idea to get in here and make sure they're here. If they're loose, we don't require any more than about 35 pounds of torque down on these. If you get an air wrench on here or something and tighten them down too much, it's not going to let the pieces rotate.
So when I basically pull the handle to open it up, the operating handle and everything comes over and the wheel locks down to the bumper. Is that correct, Steve?
Correct. Would you like to see that?
Sure. It's that easy.
It's that
Just
easy.
85 pounds of pressure to open up a Fontaine fifth wheel. It's that easy.
Lightest in the industry. Mike, this is a pretty slick looking system. Now that we're in the open position, how does it close? What happens?
Well, basically, we talked earlier about the operating handle, your secondary lock, and the pull handle. Everything's functional. We're looking at the wheel right now in the open position. What's holding the wheel open is what we call the bumper. The bumper is what basically ties everything in together and holds the wheel in the open position. With a proper kingpin height, when you're coupling up to your trailer, and we're talking 1/2 inch, if it's 1/2 inch too high, this wheel will not close because it's not going to trip the bottom tab of the bumper. That's a safety feature within the Fontaine. You cannot false couple it if it's not at the proper height level. Used to be a problem back in the industry. Not so much more today unless the guy gets in a real hurry. But let me show you real quick on how that works. Basically, the kingpin comes in, and here's where it's going to tack, but I'm going to pull up just a little bit on my bumper. Once my bumper's slid up, everything just shuts right down. Once it shuts down, and my secondary lock is basically engaged, and it can't back out, I'm properly coupled. Now, one problem that I might have down the road is when I start getting too much grease on top of the top plate, it all likes to fall down into my jaw and wedge. That causes a cold reaction time. Within that cold reaction time, if I get in snow and ice, this could be a problem because the wheel might only close partially. So I want to make sure that this is functional and quick, snappy moving when it closes. If I'm running down in the desert, I probably don't have a problem. But pay attention to that over greasing, because that's what's going to hurt you.
Mike, you know, I see the name Fontaine out there, and I always hear No-Slack. If I put a kingpin in here and close this fifth wheel, can you show me what No-Slack is and how the Fontaine system gets you to No-Slack?
You know what, Steve, I can. Why don't you grab that kingpin over there? This is a test kingpin that we use to close the wheel.
Well, it doesn't take much force.
30 pounds of pressure, that's all it takes. Close up Fontaine. You do not have to slam it. If you're slamming it, 9 times out of 10, that ½ inch I was talking about earlier, that's your situation. You need to lower down that trailer, get that plate on top of it. Make sure it triggers that bumper, because right here's where it's going to be hitting. 30 pounds of pressure, I trip the bumper slides over. You'll notice that my operating handle comes up parallel, my secondary lock is engaged. If it ever tries to back out, basically it won't do it because it catches. My handle is at 1 inch or less, all the way up against the skirt. That's good, ready to go. So here's how No-Slack works. Basically, I've got a jaw that traps the pin, and I've got a wedge that takes up the slack. This jaw and wedge work as a team. There's serrations on the back. If those serrations in between the jaw and the wedge, thanks, Steve. If the serrations are gone at any point, they're flat, they're gone. Basically, it's time for a rebuild. So go ahead and order yourself up a Fontaine genuine parts kit and put your rebuild kit into it. Once I've got my rebuild, I put the jaw in the wedge, I put it in the closed position, I make sure I got lubrication in between the two. Now we'll talk a little bit about the adjusting bolt. You'll notice that there's a spring on the adjusting bolt, Steve. Why don't you tell us how that adjusting bolt works?
Well, the way it functions, Mike, is it's spring loaded. So what that means, there's always tension on the spring puts tension on the bolt to pull it back. So you need to have about 1/4 inch gap between the end of this rod and the end of that wedge. And what that does, as wear occurs between the jaw and wedge, or if you drop one trailer and go to another one that has a little bit of wear on the kingpin, that 1/4 inch is going to allow that wedge just to work in a little further to compensate for that. It's a good idea when you're coming in for your PM, go ahead and slap a kingpin in here and check to make sure you have that 1/4 inch.
Steve, I got a question for you. What's this nylon nut? It's square. What's that purpose?
Well, that's what really holds the bolt in position. We've had different variations over my career, and I've been with Fontaine for several years now. And we have found the nylon nut to be the best fit for its purpose. We've tried a metal nut, but it sits down here, it'll rust up. It'll get to a point where you can put a 3/4 inch impact on here and you're not going to get it to back out. This material is actually made out of the same material as a football helmet, so it holds up very well. We've had the nylon nut, gosh, in place for probably 20 years now.
Very interesting. What happens if the nylon nut breaks, Steve? Do I need to replace it, or can I just run the wheel like that?
No, you want to replace that, Mike. You can run the wheel safely, but it's a good idea to go ahead in here and replace it. We do sell a kit that is the rod, the springs, and of course the nut.
Very nice. I like your No-Slack system, Steve. Can I buy one?
Can you over adjust it?
Well, if you over adjust it, all you're going to do is put premature slack into the fifth wheel. It's not going to put you in any safety situation whatsoever. You'll still get your full close, your secondary lock will be in position, your wedge will be behind the kingpin, but you're just going to put a little slack in there, and that's going to put premature wear on your stationary jaw and between your jaw and wedge. But
So,
nice question, thank you.
Basically, Steve, you're saying like when I'm pulling my boat with my pickup,
Yeah.
and I get that movement in that hitch,
You're going to fill that input.
No-Slack will take that out for me?
Correct. You're going to get
Man.
rid of all those inputs every time you stop and start. Can you imagine the discomfort for the driver going down the road, and every time he stops and starts, he's getting a little push and pull back and forth? This eliminates all that.
You know what it also probably eliminates is premature wear on your kingpins and your jaws.
Oh, absolutely.
Because anytime you're slacking metal to metal,
Yeah.
that's got to be wear.
And something we do here at Fontaine, we make our jaw and wedge out of a little bit lighter material than a kingpin. So if you're going to get some wear, you're going to get it in our pieces because they're so much easier and less expensive to replace than is a kingpin. Mike, I noticed you have the fifth wheel set up in the unlocked position. Would you mind getting the kingpin and show me how it closes?
Sure, Steve. But before I do that, let me point out some nice features about the Fontaine Fifth Wheel in the open position. Basically, number one, any driver that walks up to the back of the truck, he knows he's in the open position because his pull handle is out, ready to accept a kingpin.
Yeah.
Remember the bumper I showed you?
I do.
It's in the locked position. So basically, when I grab that kingpin tool, I'm just going to bring the kingpin tool right up into the throat. It's going to trip off that latch, the bumper, and the wheel will shut down. Before I do that, let me show you this too. There's nothing in the throat of the wheel that can get damaged in the process.
How could damage occur?
Well, damage can occur in a lot of different ways. Number one, the main thing, and not so much in our product because there's nothing up in there, but other products, it basically can hit the jaws. It can hit the wedges or any other device that's up in there that's mechanically movable. But let me show you. This is our kingpin tool. Trailer plate on the bottom of the fifth wheel. That's where it's got to be located to trip that latch. When I bring it in, 30 pounds of pressure. That's all it takes. No slamming the wheel. Basically, I'm fully locked up.
Gotcha.
Yeah. You'll notice that my pull handle, once again, an inch or less from the throat. That's going to tell me what?
That you're fully closed. You're in the
Yeah.
safe position.
And my secondary lock is
Engaged, yes.
Yep. And I'm ready to go.
Now, I noticed your rod over here. It doesn't seem to move.
Well, basically, here's the way the rod works. We showed you earlier that it's tied into the wedge.
Yes.
Right? The wedge is what takes up the slack. Period over time, basically that wedge or that jaw, if you're not properly lubricated, no lube on it, on a nice rainy day, it'll rust up a little bit. It might stick. Basically, what we want to do with the adjusting rod, and we set this up from the factory, so it has to be adjusted out. First 90 days, 30,000 miles, I want it in this position. Basically, we call it a break-in period. After the first 90 days, 30,000 miles, call it first oil change. Is when you take the kingpin tool, put it up in the wheel, and you're going to pull that bolt back about 1/4 of an inch. And you're going to fill the bolt by a gap, that 1/4 of an inch. Meaning, here's the wedge, and here's the bolt. We're going to back it out. Counterclockwise takes it out, clockwise takes it in. So why don't you go ahead and adjust that up for us?
Yeah, I noticed in your literature it said it takes 1 1/16 inch. So.
That's correct.
And I just keep turning this until I get, what, 1/4 of an inch
You want to
play
fill
in
it?
there?
Yeah.
It might take a little bit more. And so that gap is now allowing that wedge to come in a little bit further if needed.
That is correct.
Gotcha.
But being that the wheel is in the closed position, whenever I put a wrench on here, I need to do one thing.
What's that?
Reset the wheel. Because as I back that off, the springs that are up in it do not have enough torsion on them to allow that wedge to follow that bolt as you go out. So
Gotcha.
every time you put a wrench, I want to reset the wheel.
Okay.
And that's easy.
Makes sense.
If you want to hold the
Absolutely.
I open it back up, you close it down. Do we have 1/4 of an inch?
We sure do.
Look at there, piece of cake.
Perfect.
But I'll tell you right now, Steve, if this was an actual wheel that was a little bit older and been ran for maybe 2 or 3 years, we might have to adjust that up 2 or 3 times to get that wedge to actually set up to that 1/4 of an
Gotcha.
inch. Okay? Any other questions?
No, thank you. I really appreciate that.
Not a problem. Steve, yes, let me ask you a question. Basically, I got the wheel all locked up, go down the road, I'm getting ready to disconnect. What are some of the steps that I'd have to do to possibly get the wheel open before I even try to pull the handle?
Well, there's a couple of things the driver can do to put the fifth wheel in a situation where it is hard to open. Number one, if they let their tractor and trailer drift apart. We recommend that they set their trailer brakes, put the tractor in reverse, back into it, then set their tractor park brake. That takes the rear pressure off of the jaw and wedge. Back in the early 90s, air ride suspensions came out. That became kind of a nightmare for us and for everyone in the fifth wheel industry, because drivers thought that was there to help them couple and uncouple their fifth wheel. So they would, they would set their park brakes, they would hit their dump valve, get out, go back to their trailer, start cranking their dollies down. So now your trailer is here and your tractor airbags continue to deflate, so the rear of your tractor is going down. Well, what you've done now, you've put upward pressure, you put vertical pressure on your jaw and wedge, and so that can lead to a hard to open issue.
So I kind of like got it in a bind,
Correct.
and I'm trying to pull it with the pull handle. It's not going to happen.
No.
Right.
But, we're the only fifth wheel out there that has a little backup system to assist the driver or assist the technician. What you can do if you have a hard to open situation, the adjustment rod here, like we said earlier, it's spring loaded and it drives straight into the end of the locking wedge. So you can actually strike that with a hammer. It goes into the wedge, knocks the wedge back, breaks the seal between the jaw and wedge, and will allow you to go ahead and pull the fifth wheel open. It's not something you should have to do very often, but it's nice to have a backup in there if it's ever required.
So it's basically a secondary way to release the wheel if I can't get the wheel released.
That's correct.
You know what? That's
correct.
great, because I don't have to call a road service guy to come out and open my fifth wheel and charge me $300 every time that gets in that situation.
Today we wanted to go over the proper adjustment procedure for your Fontaine 6000, 7000, and H7 series top plates. Your fifth wheel will come preset from the factory at the 0 setting. It is not necessary to adjust your fifth wheel for the first 90 days or 30,000 miles. Now, after that 90 days or 30,000 miles, it is necessary to reset your adjustment to the 1/4" setting. In order to do so, you want to insert a 2-inch test kingpin. After you've inserted the test kingpin, if your setting has not been changed, you will notice that the rod will not have any free play. You must then take your wrench and turn the adjustment rod counterclockwise until you reach the 1/4" in and out movement on your adjustment rod. You must then open and close the wheel to make sure that your 1/4" adjustment is maintained. Again, push in and out on your adjustment rod to make sure that you maintain the 1/4" setting. Thank you. Hello, I'm Dan Henderson, Technical Service Coordinator for Fontaine Fifth Wheel. One of the calls that we receive is, does my fifth wheel need to be rebuilt? One of the easiest ways to check to see if your fifth wheel needs to be rebuilt is to close the fifth wheel without a kingpin. Take a large screwdriver, separate the jaw and the wedge. Take a small screwdriver, pull along between the jaw and the wedge to see if you can feel or hear the serrated teeth. If you cannot, it probably is time to do a rebuild. Once you've pulled your parts, you want to check the serrated teeth to see if you have wear on your wedge, and also the serrated teeth on your jaw and the cut that goes around the kingpin. Now that we've determined that we need to do a rebuild, you need to remember that not all rebuild kits are genuine Fontaine parts.
I'd like to thank you for your time today. Hopefully you got some good information out of this.
We'd like to invite you to visit our website at fifthwheel.com, where you can find this and much more information about the Fontaine No-Slack system.
Get connected and stay connected with Fontaine Fifth Wheel.